I think the message has been quite clear from the perspective of the first one was the Committee of Parliament on Transport, otherwise known as the Commander Committee. And the other one is the Parliamentary Accounts Committee.
Investment.
That is the Public Investments Committee, sorry. And the Transport Committee is the one that gave its report first, followed by the Public Investment Committee. The issues that they were looking at were similarly, they were more or less similar. And they just look at the PIC, for example, they were basically supposed to look at the actual cost of the project and the sources of funds. They were also supposed to look at whether the procurement process and the legal requirements were followed in awarding the tender. They were supposed to look at the list of all the tenderers and their financial and technical evaluation reports. They were to look at the sustainability and cost effectiveness of the project, clearly defining the safeguards put in place to ensure the contract sum is sustained. And finally, they were to look at the environmental impact assessment of the project. The probe seemed to center more on the propriety and legality of the procurement process for the standard gauge railway line from Mombasa to Nairobi, its cost, and whether taxpayers will be getting value for money if the project goes ahead. With regard to whether Kenyans were getting value for money for this project, there wasn't much treatment of this issue. As a matter of fact, I think there is not much light that was shed in terms of justifying the cost that has been stated variously. And I think I will use the figures that have been given rather consistently by the Cabinet Secretary for Transport, which is 327 billion. But I also bear in mind that there might be costs that had not been factored in. And so I will use the figure of 327, but I will still bear in mind that this cost would still go up. And that is the other issue that I think the committee did not address fully. The fact that two senior government officials, no less than cabinet secretaries, came before the committee and gave two different figures of what this project was supposed to cost. The cabinet secretary for Treasury, for Finance, Mr. Henry Rotich, gave a figure of 447 billion. He basically said that he had factored elements such as interest, compensation for land, insurance, management and commitment fees. So the fact that you had two figures did not seem to elicit some much consideration from the PIC. And at the very best, I think the PIC had a responsibility to shed more light on what exactly this project is supposed to cost us as a country. For now, I am saying that I will go with the 327 because it's the figure that the Cabinet Secretary for Transport has consistently put forward. But the other issue that, again, I think was not properly addressed by the PIC is the issue of conflict of interest. The company that has been awarded this tender has done a lot of things on this project that some of them would be the basis for oversight for that project. if I may just give you a few things that they have done. When they signed an MOU between with the government of Kenya in 2009, the China Road and Bridge Company offered to carry out feasibility study and preliminary designs at no cost to the government. So they were to do the feasibility study and the preliminary designs. They went ahead and did that. In 2008, the China Road and Bridge Company had written to the Ministry of Transport seeking to invest in the transport sector and proceeded to do a feasibility study for the Standard Gauge Railway line, assisting the Kenyan officials that were conducting the due diligence. So we have first the feasibility study. Secondly, they are the ones who are assisting the Kenyan officials that went to China to check, to do due diligence on the company, whether it had capacity to do the work and so on and so forth. And it's also designed the project and gave its own costing. So in other words, you have someone who you have engaged to do a project for you. They come up with a project, the design of how it is going to be done. They give you the costing for that project. And they also help you to do diligence on them to determine whether they are actually qualified and can deliver that project. I think at the very minimum, when it comes to the oversight aspects of this project, I think good sense requires that you have an independent, you have independence on the part of our officers who are dealing with this, so that it doesn't seem like we are in the process of escorting someone who has a greater stake than us in the project that they are supposed to be doing for us, and that is going to cost us quite enormously. The PIC report says that the Kenya Railways Corporation had initially used the wrong procurement method, that is the direct procurement, and that the committee fails to suggest punitive measures to address this wrongdoing in the report. So after a finding that the direct procurement was wrong, the committee did not find it necessary to issue some directions on holding people to account, those who are behind the wrong procurement method. Some of the costs, again, reading the PIC report, were repeated. The cost of procuring locomotives, for example, is factored in the first phase, that is the construction of the railway infrastructure. Number two, it is also factored in phase 2, the compulsory land acquisition. The question here is why you would want to have locomotives at these phases, when we know clearly that the phase of construction of the railway infrastructure, you would require the line for you to have locomotives, because locomotives run on the lines. There's also the issue of the land acquisition. Again, if you're acquiring land, it means you're acquiring the land so that you can lay infrastructure. So if you essentially are going to buy locomotives at every stage, at least what the committee ought to have told us is what is the rationale of doing this. Considering that from a layman's point of view, it doesn't seem to make a lot of sense. And this could actually account for the seemingly exaggerated cost of this project. And here the Cabinet Secretary for National Treasury had tried to explain why his figure was higher than that was given by the Cabinet Secretary for Transport. And basically he said that he was including costs such as resettlement, demolitions, and statutory expenses, among others. And one wonders whether really in coming up with these figures, the various departments, Transport and National Treasury, were actually in sync, or they were working together on this. There is the government of the Cabinet Secretary for Transport said that they had put together an independent review and supervision mechanism to oversee the construction and the quality of work of this project. I think if I have said correctly, it looks like this independent review and supervision unit was not in place at the point when this the PIC was writing its report, at least going by the Cabinet Secretary's subsequent remarks that they were going to put together that team. But of course, what you would have expected the committee to ask and get answers, and also forward those answers in their report for Kenyans to know, is who are these independent reviewers? Who are they, and at what cost are they going to be doing the work that they are doing? And when did they start their work? It seems like the PIC either forgot or neglected to ask for this information, which is really critical, just to assure that there is some independent oversight on the project. The other bit that is important to look at is really the whole fact that the company that won this tender, or that was awarded this tender, did not appear before the committee at all. They basically neglected all the summons that were issued by the PIC. And the PIC found that they were in contravention of Article 125 of the Constitution, Section 14 and 23 of the National Assembly Powers and Privileges Act, and the Standing Orders number 191. But even with this finding, there were no consequences. So the company could violate all these legal provisions and defy the summons of the PIC, and the PIC found it not fit to sanction this kind of behavior. There is also a recommendation that the committee made. They made the recommendation that the Kenya Railways Corporation and the Ministry of Transport should ensure that the project addresses connectivity to other towns such as Mombasa, Kilifi Port, Konza Techno City, and others. This connectivity, of course, if you would recall the presentation by Kerera Wangogi, is not envisaged in the line as we know it now. And of course, the question is, why was this not done in the first place, right on the onset? And this proposal, what informs this proposal on the part of the PIC, and what is likely to be the cost implication of it? I think that's a question. It's a proposal that is made, but it doesn't seem to be to have flesh, to have been a very well considered proposal, going beyond just the wishful, the wish that the connectivity be done across various other countries, various other towns. There was no documentation that was provided to the PIC also to show that this was a government-to-government arrangement. The only thing that was provided was a letter, and nothing else was provided. So I think it still raises the question whether this was the intention right from the start, or it was just a way of trying to avoid the public procurement disposal act, which might have ended up violating the act in the first place, but again without any consequences. The PIC also notes that the procurement of the project was done poorly, and that the Public Procurement and Oversight Authority did not do due diligence at all. And the only reported due diligence was by the Kenya Railway Corporation through the interministerial delegation that undertook the visit to China to look into the workings of this company. And it's noteworthy that the Chinese embassy in Nairobi had written in 2012 expressing support and confirming the capacity of the company to undertake the project. So in a sense, you would say that the principles of due diligence were not fully observed here. I did mention when I was talking about the TORs for the committee, I mentioned that they were supposed to look at the environmental impact assessment. The report says nothing about that at all. So it's one of the aspects that were completely left out. Of course, this is a 27-member committee. It summoned 19 people before it. And therefore, one would have expected that a lot of the questions that still remain unanswered about this project would have been answered through the PIC. I think in a sense, I could say that the PIC did not do a good job. And perhaps then one would wonder whether the PIC just set out to clear this project without necessarily answering the questions that needed to be answered. I will talk very briefly about the Committee on Transport, Public Works and Housing. They're the ones that gave the initial report, and I would say that again, this committee looked into this, into the SGR project as a result of a question that was asked by a member of parliament. And there are specific issues that the member of parliament had asked which were not completely dealt with. Again, the report seems not to have looked at some of the documentation that was available to them, and so some of their findings are inconclusive or not supported by documentation. There was also the issue whether the SGR was likely to upset the infrastructural arrangement between Kenya and its neighbors, but also important, the existing concession agreement between the Rift Valley, in favor of the Rift Valley Railways in both Kenya and Uganda. I think this issue was not looked at significantly in this report. Subsequently, when I had written I've written an opinion in the press raising the possibility that we would be setting ourselves up for paying damages to the Rift Valley Railways Company. The MD of the Kenya Railways Corporation wrote in the press again and said that the Rift Valley Railways were ready and gearing themselves to coexist with the Standard Gauge Railway. I don't know the nitty-gritties of that concession that they have. I do know for sure that it's supposed to be coming to an end, I believe, end of this month. and listening to the Cabinet Secretary recently, it looks like the government has decided that it is going to extend this concession or give a new concession, which of course they will send for it in terms of the investment targets, and also the tonnage. I understand from people who are in the know that at least the investment target was met, but the tonnage target was not met. I will leave that with you so that you can also look at. I had looked at what the report says about the work that the China Road and Bridge Company has done in construction of railways, and it seems a very interesting business. I think the committee says that this company has done 752 kilometers in 35 years. And whether that was an error or not, I don't know. But remember that the distance from Mombasa to Nairobi is roughly about 500, slightly less than 500 kilometers. So either this was an omission, or this company may actually not have experience in the kind of work that we are asking them to do. There is also the matter of this company having been blacklisted by the World Bank at some point. And this blacklisting did not seem to have any impact on our decision at all. I understood that, again, from the MD of the Kenya Railways Corporation through his article, that the World Bank the blacklisting by the World Bank was not meant to extend beyond that local circumstance that the company was operating in. But still, it is material when you hear a company has been blacklisted by anyone, any credible government or institution across the globe. It is actually material that ought to be factored in, and this is a matter that the committee ought to have looked at. At that point in time, we did not have the details that we know now. The financing agreement has been signed. The figures, our own contribution as a country in this is supposed to be 10%, not the 15% that had earlier been mentioned. And we also know that we are supposed to repay this loan because the 90% is essentially a loan split into two. So one is a commercial loan and a concessionary loan. The rates ranging between 2.5% and 4%. So that is information that we know now. But the committee, when it was looking at all this documentation, left this information not just glossed over. So we didn't have much of, we didn't have a lot of information on that. I think I will stop here and I will be ready to respond to any questions that you might have.
Kenya, as some of you might be aware, is a nation where we have a GDP of about 3.4 trillion Kenya shillings. And out of that 3.4 trillion shillings, the public debt, the size of public debt, stands at about 2.3 trillion. So you can imagine it is already quite high. This comes to about 57% or thereabouts. And so arguments that have been going on in the press have been around the size of our debt as it relates to the proportion of GDP vis-a-vis the sustainability of that debt. And so if you compare to other countries, the African average of debt to GDP ratios is about 35%. But you have to remember that some African nations have actually have debt waivers under the highly indebted debt countries, so HIPIC initiative by the UN and the IMF. And some of these countries have also, not borrowed as heavily as Kenya has borrowed. So in terms of comparisons between the Kenyan situation and the African average, we are certainly far much above the 35% that is average for Africa. But really, economists have often argued what is the sustainable debt level. And the consistent figure that is often put there, though it's not, there's no consensus on it, is that it should be at about 70%. And so studies have shown that beyond 70%, given certain limits of economic growth, you actually then begin to harm your economy. Now, these figures I'm giving as at last year, June 2013, or rather September 2013, and they are sourced from the Central Bank of Kenya. Now, as you remember, this year we've had now significant developments. The first, of course, is the Chinese arrangement which we've gone into, where we've borrowed 327 million. And then we've had the floating of the issue of the Eurobond, which is also another over 300 billion shillings. So essentially, we've added about 50% of our debt to the position where we are at in September 2013. So the situation is now perhaps much higher. So it might not even be 57% of GDP. It can actually be close to 70 or even above 70% of GDP. So that's important to bear in mind, because when it comes now to looking at the issue of debt sustainability, to what extent can this borrowing have an effect on our domestic economy? We have to look at how the composition of these debts. And so if you come down to breaking down this debt, we have two types of debt, as already been mentioned. We've got external debt, and then we've got domestic debt. Of the 2.3 that I spoke of, domestic debt is about 1.2 trillion. So these are instances where the government comes to the market through open market operations, and they borrow from fund managers and investment managers based in Kenya. And so this is about 1.1%, and so therefore constituting about 57% of total public debt. So that means that foreign or external debt is at about 0.8 or 0.9 trillion. So if you take the two already, it is quite high. And so when we're looking at impacts, we know the biggest mechanism for us to be affected by that is through the interest rate. So the most obvious or the most direct influence is through the domestic borrowing, which government often does, before we even look at external financing. So if you look at domestic borrowing, we have the government typically issues securities, treasury bonds, and so on, that are either denominated in 5-year or 10-year or even 20-year currencies. Now, I learned a few days ago, this week, the government took to the primary market, which is essentially an IPO of bonds. So the government took its 5-year and 20-year debt instruments to sell to members of the public. And the yields that they attracted actually increased. The quotations I'm getting are that the 5-year bond coupon rate has a yield of about 12%, which is previously the yield of a 10-year bond. And the 20-year bond has now a yield of about 13%. And if you look at the market average, they are actually quite close to those annual yield rates. So what it tells us is this, that in the first instance we have got two effects. The price, because the yield is really essentially a price. It's what people pay, or what government pays back to the people for lending them the money, whatever they borrow. So what it tells us is that we are paying for the 5-year bond, coupon bond, we are paying the price of a 10-year one. So there's an escalation, and in fact it rose by about 106 basis points. So essentially interest rates have already gone up, and this is last week, so it could be because of the Eurobond that was floated, but I'll come to that. Then secondly, if you look at the 20-year yield rate, the yield rate together with the market average is at the same level. It's actually the same point, the same price point. Essentially, it's showing us that, you know how the markets work, bond markets work is, you've got traders who go in and buy the primary document. So they buy the actual security. And then, so this is bought at the primary market. So once they buy it, they go and sell it in a secondary market so that they can make some small monies on top for their clients and earn some commission. So usually the secondary price, the price of the secondary market is usually significantly higher than the price of the primary market. But the situation as we have it today is that the primary market price, which is the yield of that coupon for the 20-year bond, is about 13.7%. And yet the market average price, which is the price of the secondary market, is the same 13.75. Essentially meaning that that one event has wiped out the secondary market, because now the trader cannot make any margin. They go to the secondary market and it's the same price. So we essentially, by that one, whatever, we've killed the secondary market. So we expect traders to not buy 20-year bond, or they will buy and keep. They will not buy for trading in the secondary market. So already we are beginning to see the implications of the debt. We are seeing a rise in interest rates. And so to connect that now with external borrowing, you know, the major departure point that we have today is that external borrowing has been through IMF and development partners. So these are concession loans. Now, last year we took out syndicated loans, which are essentially just non-concession loans. And the figure that Treasury has given us is that we took out loans of about 600 million. Okay. Now this 600 million was supposed to be for meeting our recurrent expenditure and some of our urgent payments that we needed. And this loan was due by, I think, September last year. We need to repay off this syndicated loan. And we could not pay it. The reason being is that we didn't have enough liquidity to make those payments. And so for that reason, the Eurobond that has been floated, part of the proceeds or part of the monies collected from that Eurobond is meant to pay off these syndicated loans. Essentially what it means is that a syndicated loan is already a loan that you're getting at a higher interest rate, which is non-concession, and these are between 4 to 7%. And so already it's expensive. And then we're going to the Eurobond, where we are also raising money, and these are also non-concession. So again, the same interest rates apply. So essentially we are borrowing money, expensive money, to come and pay off other expensive monies. Now obviously we have very few options at this point, because and that's why we're borrowing, otherwise we would not be borrowing. But what it implies is that we are worsening the situation for ourselves when it comes to the signals that we are sending, particularly in our money markets and in our stock exchange and securities markets. So that is an important point to bear, because we, in addition to having borrowed expensive money, we've exposed our domestic economy to forces that we have less control of. As was stated, we have floated this in the international markets. And international markets, you have your coupon rate for which you pay, but the coupon rate then develops a secondary market. And that secondary market acts or is manipulated by individuals who are informed by tastes, preferences, emotions, information, and actions that our government takes. So it means that if, the same argument that was being made, if we are not prudential in the management of our affairs, the premiums that are going to be charged on us, particularly in the secondary market, will be much, much higher. And the effect that has is one of two. The first thing that we have to recognize is, domestically, we have a benchmark interest rate, which is the central bank rate. Now, every month, the central bank sits down and says that, look, because inflation is at a certain level and employment is at a certain level, we want to either raise or lower or maintain interest rates at a given rate, so that banks can then get a signal for how to then set their own lending rates that eventually the individuals and private firms can borrow. The effect is actually transmitted all the way to our own stock exchange, to our own money market. And therefore it displaces the central bank rate as the key benchmark rate for determining the price of credit in Kenya. And so essentially what we will have done, because already the primary coupon rate is high, the secondary coupon rate is likely to be high, we will have even higher interest rates in the country. And so that's a very big danger for which we've walked ourselves into. And so it is prudent for us to actually seek answers to the questions that are proposed here. To what extent are we managing, are we pursuing prudential financial management? The other thing that I want to mention is when it comes to foreign exchange, because that's the other mechanism by which we have impacts in terms of borrowing. This Eurobond is denominated in foreign currency, which is the US dollar. And essentially, the government will be getting an influx of forex from the sale of this Eurobond. And obviously, this is going to affect the position, Kenya's position in terms of the foreign reserves held by the central bank, as well as the central bank, or rather the foreign exchange rate level for which the Kenya shilling trades with the dollar. Now, there are two effects that might arise. There could be a weakening of the shilling, because really demand for the dollar will go down, because now you have more dollars, you have increased supply of dollars, so demand for the dollar will go down, so you've got an appreciation of the Kenya shilling. So if that happens, then it makes our exports much more expensive to the world. So the effect of that is to contract export value expectations. On the other hand, if these foreign reserves are therefore, or rather if the money earned from these Eurobonds are actually used to boost the reserves that we have at central bank, and therefore not release it to the market, it could actually constrain the number of, or rather the supply of US dollars in the market, and therefore leading to greater or heightened demand for US dollars, leading to depreciation of our currency. And if that happens, it means that basically our export position will improve, because really our exports will be cheaper in the international market. But I think this is unlikely to happen, simply because of we're getting a huge influx of forex, and therefore leading to what I've discussed. And so really, if we apply ourselves to back to this debt composition issue. The question then that central bankers do is they perform what are known as stress tests. So essentially they look at, they have, you know, various targets along for various indicators, debt indicators. And therefore they make assumptions that what if our GDP growth dampens or reduces by this much, what kind of position would we be in terms of debt, and how would it impact our sustainability of our debt. And the one that I've seen, the stress tests that I've seen, these were done in September last year. So they exclude the 327 billion bond from China and the Euro bond. Actually indicated that one particular indicator went off target. So essentially there was a fundamental weakness in the debt position, in Kenya's debt position. So it tells us that at that time, even with less debt than we are today, we needed to take remedial action. And so that perhaps is a big thing we need to underline, because that was only one indicator of 4. All 4 have to, for you to be sustainable, all 4 have to check off. So now our situation we've increased our debt by about 2/3. About 2/3, because if you take 300 billion from the Euro bond, 300 billion from the China's loan, it's quite significant. What comes to my mind is that if we do those stress tests today, that particular indicator might actually be worse, or even more indicators will not meet their targets. And the problem is, as someone who sits outside government, we don't have this information, we don't have the most current up-to-date statistics on those indicators for us to perform those stress tests ourselves. So the other thing that comes into mind is there is an information deficiency right from the start around this whole debt issue, which we should also be raising. We don't have enough information in the public to consider the options that are available for government, and for us also to be able to also help government in shaping their own policy reforms that we want to see. So with those 3 remarks, I think I'll stop there. But really what I did is just restrict myself to the impacts and